Welcome, everyone. My name is Piper Hendricks. I'm the CEO of Stories Change Power, and we're so glad that you're here. At Stories Change Power, we help people build their civic muscle, meaning you want to contribute to your community, you recognize what's needed, and you work with others, including people with different views and backgrounds to shape solutions. Like any muscle, civic muscle grows through practice, collaboration, and consistency over time. That takes strength, endurance, and flexibility, which we build in our coaching, our short courses, our learning communities, and here on our monthly webinars. Today is October 10th, which, yes, is a Friday, but it's also an idealist day. Idealist days are those 12 days a year where the date is the same forwards and backwards. January 1st, 1/1, December 12th, 12/12, and like today, 10/10. We will share a link in the chat and the recording description, but in short, idealist days are days to do something to improve your community, and that may be your local community, or you might define it more broadly. If you aren't familiar with idealist days and don't have something already in mind, we have a suggestion. I'm curious if anyone has heard of the show Crossfire. Drop me a note in the chat. Just say yes if you have. You might remember it's a show that Sam Feist created back in the 1980s, which feels like eons ago, and it lasted until 2005. Often it was very loud, contentious, and we can look back on it now. I think we can probably agree unhelpful at times. Well, tonight, C-SPAN, same producer, Sam Feist, will be premiering a new show called Ceasefire that will highlight cross-party conversations and what we don't see enough of. To quote C-SPAN, they will show the quiet, serious work of governing across differences. We will share a link to that too, and we'll include in our follow-up email. So consider helping us spread the world, spread spread the word and improve the world this idealist day as we work toward more ideal approaches to politics across the country. 4 quick reminders, and then we'll turn it over to today's speakers to hear about ideal ways to use AI. Number one, we've got captions on, so use those if they're helpful to you. This is a webinar, so you'll stay off camera, off mic, stay hydrated, stay comfortable, and use the chat to communicate with us. It's for constructive conversation among our human friends only. Your AI can watch the recording about AI, but we keep our respectful chat for humans, and we will not share the chat with the recording. All your questions, though, please put those in the Q&A. There's a little box you'll see in the middle of the bottom of your screen. It's helpful for us to be sure we don't lose any of your questions. Put those in the Q&A, and we will answer those at the end of today's presentation. Or if we don't have space, we add more answers onto our LinkedIn page. With that, it is an absolute pleasure to introduce Drs. Ashby King and Salzano. Dr. Drew Ashby King is an assistant professor in the School of Communication at East Carolina University, where he teaches courses in public relations and strategic communication. His research investigates questions at the intersection of public relations and socio-political issues and considers who has power within specific communicative spaces, how organizational messages and public's responses reinforce and challenge dominant narratives and hegemonic ideologies, and how organizations can engage with emerging technologies in responsible ways that promote social change. Drew's scholarship has appeared in many outlets, including Public Relations Review, Journal of Public Relations Research, Public Relations Inquiry, and Communication Education. Welcome, Drew. Dr. Matthew Salzano is an assistant professor of communication at Stony Brook University, specializing in critical AI, digital studies, and rhetorical theory. His research explores how people and technology interact in communication efforts towards social change, examining how new media influences possibilities for civic participation. His scholarship has appeared in journals such as the Quarterly Journal of Speech, Critical Studies in Media Communication, and Public Relations Inquiry. Matthew is currently writing his first book that I cannot wait to read, Just Participating, Reformatting Critical Sensibilities When There's Just Too Much, about the challenges of participation in digital and political environments that demand our engagement. Both Drew and Matthew co-lead a Waterhouse Family Institute-funded project investigating generative AI use by social change communicators. Welcome to you both. So glad that you're here today. Before I fully turn it over to you, we will have a poll pop up. And we've got 3 questions today. If you've been on our webinars before, you know that we like to get a sense of who's on the call before we dive in. The first question will be familiar. We're asking, how long have you been an advocate? And what we mean by that is how long have you been using your civic muscle, making a difference in your community? You can define that as broadly as you'd like. We define advocacy as trying to change policies, laws, and systems. That is broad. So pop in your answers there. Maybe you're brand new, you've been here a good while, you've been here a long while, you're a pro, or maybe you work in a different field and you don't think of using your civic muscle. Second question, how often are you using AI in your work? We've got an option there for every day, a few times a week, a few times a month, less than that, or never. And our third question today, and this one you can select all that apply to you. When you use AI, what kind of tasks are you using it to assist you with or complete for you? Our options include content drafting and generation, idea generation and brainstorming, content refinement, editing, proofreading, summarizing and data review, audience or tone customization, optimization and technical tasks, or you use AI minimally and really only when you're required to by your organization. If you're not able to access the poll, feel free to put your responses in the chat, or if you want to elaborate, if there's something in there, one of the options doesn't quite apply, we'd love to hear from you there. I'm seeing a lot of responses coming in. I know three questions takes a little bit longer, so we'll give folks just a bit longer before we close the poll. Maybe 3, 2, I see a few more responses. If we cut you off, I do apologize. Pop those into the chat, but I'll go ahead and end the poll here, and you'll see the results pop up. If you're on the live session, on the recording, you won't see these, so I'll share. We've got about a quarter of folks who have been in advocacy or using their muscle, civic muscle, a good long while. About 40%, or sorry, a good while, 3 to 7 years. 40% a good long while, and we've got a few pros here, about a quarter of us. So welcome everyone. On using AI in your work, about a quarter of folks use it every single day, 40% a few times a week, a little bit over 10% a few times a month. This is interesting, about a quarter, so 1 month or less, and no one on the call said that they never use it. So here we are. And then lastly, we've got, I'd say, about half of folks content drafting and generation, idea generation, content refinement, summarizing and data review. Good, about 50% of everybody on that. Quarter on audience or tone customization, not very many on optimization or technical tasks, and then a handful who say I use it minimally or only when required. So thank you, everyone. It is very helpful for us to have a sense of who's here. And with that, Drew and Matthew, I will pass over to you for today's presentation.
Great. Well, thank you, everyone. Thanks, Piper, for the lovely introduction. Great to hear we've got sort of diverse AI experience and interests in the room. I think we've got something for everybody today. We'll see what you think. And I'm hopeful everyone will get something out of this. I am surprised there's no nevers. That's kind of fun that we've got. Everybody's using the AI at least a little bit, so that's great. Well, Drew and I are excited to speak with you all today. Our goal today is to share some of our ongoing research with you about AI and social change communication, mostly centered around our idea of participatory AI public relations, a concept we hope can help guide decisions about responsible use of AI and PR and strategic communication, especially in the social change space. Our talk has 3 parts today. First, I'm going to talk a little bit about what's going on with AI and PR and the need for what we're calling paper. And then Drew will talk about our newest under review research about how social change communicators are using AI. Then finally, we'll give some recommendations on how you might put paper into social change work. And like good professors, we'll do a little activity to see how you'd apply paper in particular scenarios. So let's get started. I assume everyone can see my slides and such. Drew, you can see my slides? Okay, Drew's nodding. Great, let's continue. So Drew and I started our first AI project in fall 2023, about a year after ChatGPT was released. Drew's a critical public relations researcher, and I'm a critical media and rhetorical studies researcher. So we shared an interest in understanding how this technology was going to change the possibilities of communication. And in particular, we share interests in advocacy communication, social justice, and social change. We wanted to know how would this technology change the possibilities of using communication for social good, for trying to make the world a better place. For our first project, we wanted to think kind of broad and explore what assumptions people made about the work communication professionals do when proposing that communicators use AI in their communication work. So we started the project that became this paper in Public Relations Inquiry, examining proposed generative AI integrations in PR, offering participatory AI public relations. I believe we're going to share a link in the chat now so you can access this if you're interested. We collected 63 instructive articles and blog posts about AI that were written for audiences of public relations professionals that were published between January 1st and June 30th, 2023. So sort of like the first 6 months of the first full calendar year of ChatGPT. These are articles by industry thought leaders who were attempting to guide people on how they might use generative AI when it was still brand new. I imagine many of you will find these sort of familiar if you were in the space at the time and trying to figure out what to do with this new tool. And so here's some examples of the sort of material we found. With the time saved on content creation, communicators will have more bandwidth to perform higher value tasks that AI can't always facilitate. Big picture endeavors such as ideation and innovation are best impacted by the keen instincts and human touch that PR pros possess. Or this other one. Many experts believe that AI will actually serve to augment the work of human writers rather than replace them. By providing writers with tools to automate certain tasks, such as research and data analysis, AI will free up more time for writers to focus on the creative aspects of their work. What we see here in examples like this are some specific values about what matters in the work of PR and strategic communication. In this case, it's specifically devaluing the work of content creation and research and data analysis. So in our paper, Drew and I found that in general, these instructive guides positioned generative AI tools as ways to make the everyday work of PR more productive and efficient, and position public relations as a product, something that's produced, got through, and finished. The processes of listening, interacting, creating, and writing are pushed to the side in favor of speed and efficiency. And in doing so, public relations becomes an outcome rather than an ongoing commitment to communication and dialogue. These dominant discourses suggested that generative AI could solve the problem of having to engage with and understand the nuanced perspectives of varying publics and communicating with them toward co-created meaning. Now, hopefully you saw my scare quotes around problems, and you're hopefully already thinking what maybe Drew and I were, that is this really a problem that should be solved? To us, committing to participation in and with publics is what the work of communication professionals should be. Of all of us, communication professionals need to be able to engage with diverse perspectives and people and not outsource it to AI. We think this is especially important for folks like you all, who we imagine understand communication and advocacy as important parts not just of getting a message out, but as key to fostering relationships and building communities. And we found that dominant perspectives in PR at the time were contradictory to those values. What we really aim to point out in this research is that AI use involves decisions about what you value as a communicator, whether you realize it or not. I doubt many of the folks writing these pieces we analyzed had consciously decided, I value efficiency more than human engagement. Those are implicit assumptions that are exactly what we wanted to point out and bring more into conversation. Drew and I believe we all need to ask the question of ourselves and our organizations, what are we willing to lose when we use AI in our work? As philosopher Megan Fritz has written in the literary magazine The Point, to come up with a good AI policy for a university, a department, or even a household, one first has to have an idea of which skills and formative experiences they're prepared to lose for the sake of AI use, and which ones they'll fight to retain. And it's here that we've discovered that consensus is most importantly lacking. So in our paper, we proposed one way to help communicators make decisions about what skills to retain or lose. To counter the dominant guidance, we chose to highlight the importance of participation to public relations in what we call participatory AI public relations, that we shorten cutely to PAPER. Do you get it? It's like you're using paper instead of AI. It's kind of a joke. I'm imagining you're all laughing behind the webinar screen because I can't actually see you. Our findings show how generative AI integrations lead to a perspective toward public relations that views the participatory practices of PR as labor not worth human effort. In our view, this would be remarkably unethical, as it untethers communication practitioners from actually relating to publics. Importantly, however, paper does not completely disavow the use of generative AI. Instead, it reorients the use of generative AI in public relations and strategic communication. not around increasing efficiency by avoiding the relational work of engagement with other humans, but by aiding in that participation. Participation that increases relations by finding moments for connection and for establishing relationships. We offer paper as a normative framework that practitioners, scholars, and educators can use as they begin to embrace and experiment using generative AI in their work, with a focus on three central ideas. First, human-human relations should be at the center of public relations. Second, generative AI can supplement but shouldn't replace human writers and creators. And finally, ethical concerns should be evaluated prior to and while using generative AI tools. As Drew will soon explain, this is all predicated on a view of PR and strategic communication we think is particularly relevant to advocates and social change communicators, who believe that their communication efforts are not only about producing a product and completing a job for which you're paid a salary, but also that your efforts are about convening people around issues of shared concern in hopes of making change. Put differently, we believe considering paper is especially relevant and important for people who see their strategic communication efforts as an important part of participation in broader ecosystems of change. And with that, I'll turn it over to Drew.
Thank you, Matthew. As Matthew mentioned, once we had this kind of broader perspective, considering our research interests and what really drives what we're interested in exploring, we really wanted to focus in on this idea of generative AI use in social change communication. And so to start with that, we really need to think about what is unique about social change communication versus public relations and strategic communication generally. So when we're thinking about social change communication or social change communicators, we're thinking about those that use communication to address those things in the world that are unhealthy, unsafe, or unjust. And so social change communicators use public relations and strategic communication to facilitate values co-creation between stakeholders to drive social change, provide a platform for recursive feedback loops, and they bring stakeholder beliefs into the open to provide a foundation for collective sense making. And this was kind of the starting point for our research. So what did we actually do? Before I get into the specifics, I do want to say a quick thank you to the Waterhouse Family Institute for the Study of Communication and Society at Villanova University that funded this research and helped us make sure we could compensate our participants, and will hopefully be funding some open access publications at some point in the future. And so what we were really interested in with this study was answering two questions. First, we were interested in looking at how social change communication professionals are using generative AI in their work. We thought this may be different, and we were interested in understanding if it was. And second, how do social change communication professionals conceptualize the benefits and the drawbacks of using generative AI in their work? And so to answer these questions, we conducted interviews with 22 social change communicators between November 2024 and February of 2025. And we focused on how participants were using generative AI tools in their work. We were asking them about how they understood or thought about the benefits and drawbacks of their generative AI use. And then we also delved into some of their ethical considerations when using generative AI. In the sections that follow, I'm going to be talking about our participants and sharing some quotes. Just know that these are pseudonyms, they're not their real names, so that we're maintaining participant privacy, but also humanizing them rather than just calling them participant 1 and participant 2. So what did we actually find? How are social change communicators using AI? So first, through our analysis, we identified 3 ways that social change communicators were using generative AI in their work. First was generative AI as an active collaborator. Using generative AI as an active collaborator can be thought of as using AI tools to complete tasks that would often be given to junior colleagues or interns. These include writing and developing content, summarizing information, editing and copywriting, and creating titles and headlines. Across all of these uses, generative AI is playing a major role in the creation of communication and messages. One of our participants, Liam, explained, I've trained a particular chat that I can go back to all the time to write very similar to me, so that I might ask it to draft a reply to an email. He also explained that he writes a lot of proposals for clients and has trained generative AI so that he can, in his words, describe briefly the vision for the problem and solution of working with a client, and then the AI, can reference past samples and write like me or build a proposal. Another participant, Mia, explained that she used generative AI tools to, quote, generate copy for social media posts, summarize reports and pieces that our team send to us that we need to understand quickly, and draft landing page copy for our releases. Across all of these examples, generative AI tools played an active role in our participants' workflow. It significantly shaped the final products that participants produced. In some cases, it nearly created the entire product. Second is this idea of generative AI as a thought partner. When participants were using generative AI as a thought partner, they were using AI tools in place of getting feedback or support from a colleague down the hall. In these cases, participants were using generative AI tools to help them get through moments of writing block, to generate ideas they may not have been able to come up with themselves, and to tailor content for specific audiences. As one participant, Elijah, noted, generative AI tools are, to him, useful because otherwise I need to get a thought partner, right? Otherwise, I need to call somebody. And I could do that, but then I've got to arrange the call. And ChatGPT is always on, it's sort of always there. It's much easier to type into the ChatGPT box than it is to take the time to set up time with a friend or colleague to work through challenges that you're having. As Evelyn said, it's helpful for small tasks, generating a headline, translating into other languages, helping revise a complex sentence. Like I said, when you're stuck. Another participant, Isabella, built on this notion, saying, I found that it can be helpful. It can be a helpful thought partner when there's a point in the day when I'm like, I just need something to help me get started. What connects these approaches was participants using generative AI tools to review their work, to help them kind of get a spark, to get them going, and to assess if they've constructed messages relevant to their audiences they were trying to reach. AI was playing a role here, but it wasn't the central creator of these texts and messages and pieces of communication. And then third was the notion of generative AI as a concern. Not many, but a few of our participants were reluctant to incorporate generative AI into their workflow. Some were concerned with how generative AI tools could change the landscape of communication as a field of practice when anybody could use generative AI to write messages and create content that would then flood communicative spaces, especially those online. And others did not want to use generative AI tools at all, but were being required to use them by their employer. One of our participants, Isabella, said that she uses generative AI cautiously or judiciously. And she said that she did this because there's just so much clutter and junk to be cutting through. She didn't want to be unconsciously contributing to that just because AI could allow her to. Sophia, another participant, only used generative AI because she was required to and said, in theory, it replaces the process of having someone copy edit it for me, but it would be more thorough if a human copy edited something for me. I find that I'm using AI to try and fix a more institutional problem that I think the better solution would be for us to have better internal processes. For these participants, cautiously using generative AI tools or trying not to use them at all was important because of the possible implications, many of which we currently don't know, but they were really concerned with the implications of generative AI on how we communicate in public. So considering the kind of ways that they were using generative AI, we're interested in digging in a little bit more to understand what the benefits and drawbacks of their use was. Aligned with the prior findings that we had that Matthew outlined, number one benefit for participants was efficiency. Participants were using generative AI because it increased their efficiency. They believed the tools allowed them to do more with less and get tedious work that used to be time-consuming done much more quickly, which is valuable for those in social change spaces because they often have limited resources. Many of our participants really emphasize the value of this efficiency because their organizations were often running incredibly small communication teams. As one participant, Olivia, explained, I would say tasks that I'm doing myself, generative AI would cut the time in half for simple things like that. But for tasks that I'm working with on with other people, I would say it reduces my time. It would just maybe be like 25%. So a 25 to 50% increase in being able to complete tasks, definitely significantly more efficient if those estimates are accurate. The second benefit, which ties into efficiency, is the notion of really getting to center the human work of communication. As using generative AI tools made participants more efficient, they explained that they could complete everyday mundane tasks at a faster rate, which would give them more opportunity to spend time doing more valuable work that they believed only humans could do. As Riley put it, I think it's transitioned me into more of a curator or a fact checker and a strategist rather than just a copywriter. They didn't vision themselves just as writing now, but as actually making strategic decisions and curating different things, which was a human thing that they felt they could do and AI couldn't. Isabella noted, it can be helpful if it's helping you do what you're already needing to do and free up that time to be more thoughtful, more connected, all of that. So although there were these benefits, our participants they still had challenges. And we described the commonalities among these challenges of using generative AI that participants discussed as experiencing a sense of friction. So these are challenges or concerns that made them pause, reconsider, or change their generative AI use. For example, generative AI tools will often produce inaccurate or incorrect information. As Aurora, one of our participants, put it simply, she said, ChatGPT will lie and make things up. And, that creates challenges. That's a problem that needs to be addressed. More specifically, in the social change context, our participants explained that generative AI tools often misrepresent the marginalized communities at the center of their work. Evelyn explained, we have our own inclusive language guide, and we're not using the same terms that AI is using. And that created challenges, editing, the inability to use tools for certain things. Building on this notion was the idea then that generative AI in many ways might be devaluing communication work. Although many of our participants valued what generative AI offered them, they did also share some concerns, some more explicitly and some implicitly, that increased generative AI use could devalue the work of communication. Many participants emphasized they felt less connected to their work because they were not creating it. A generative AI tool was. One participant, Mia, felt, in her words, a lack of ownership over the final products. She said, I didn't really create this, and so do I really know much about this because I didn't write it? Recognizing that writing is a process where we develop our ideas and refine our thoughts. And if AI does all the writing, do we really know what's in this? Aurora said using generative AI tools made her feel like, in her words, she was being automated as AI writing became the standard and she was not exercising her own writing skills. And so what we had to think about then was, are these really aligned with paper? How are our participants using it? And Matthew's going to start digging into that in the next section.
Thanks, Drew. Yeah, so after Drew and I spoke to all these social change communication professionals, it was time for us to go back to the concept of paper and think through how we could better explain it and adapt it, both to analyze the trends we saw in this interview data, but also to make sure that paper could be useful to this particular context. When we initially proposed this research, we sort of hypothesized that social change communicators would have developed AI practices that would integrate insights from the practice of social change and develop specific methods for using AI that would be different from sort of PR and strategic communication use of AI in general. We thought maybe social change communicators would be a little more clued in about AI's energy use or how it relies on the surveillance capitalism and the sort of privacy concerns typical of big tech or AI bias issues and that sort of thing. And while social change communicators certainly brought that up, it didn't really seem to influence their sense of what they did with the AI tool. It doesn't change what they were doing. In general, our answer to the question we sort of started out with on whether they were doing paper-aligned practices or doing something different than sort of general PR practitioners is no. It aligned pretty closely with what other PR scholars are saying PR practitioners are doing with AI. And it's mostly to maximize efficiency. But that said, as Drew just pointed out, they did experience some unique frictions. They bring a level of expertise and human understanding of their publics and the social issues they're interested in that's not always reflected in generative AI models. And so we think we can adapt paper and introduce paper in ways that are helpful and useful in the particular context of social change. Paper suggests that communicators should make decisions about generative AI use through the criteria of participation, whether that AI use will assist or offload engagement with publics. And we believe such values resonate with the work of social change communication that prioritizes efforts towards societal goals rather than efficient progress toward organizational outcomes alone. When important messages are solely written by generative AI tools with limited, if any, human involvement, then human participation and relationships are not at the center of communication being done. We posit that this approach, intentionally or not, can function to position publics as not worth the investment it takes to be an active participant in the relationship. As social change communicators, this disinvestment from participating in publics runs counter to the goals of social change. To create societal change, especially democratically, advocates and social change organizations need to be actively engaged in their communities, modeling the sort of participation they need from their publics in order to create lasting change. For that reason, we believe social change communicators have to strongly assert that their expertise and the practice of public relations in the social change context cannot be adequately replaced by generative AI use. If not, then organizations with limited resources may not see communicators as a necessary hire, a move that would not only be detrimental for the profession, but also would impair the future of social change.
So, given these ideas, our latest research in the research that we're currently working on getting published that we've been talking about here, we make 4 recommendations for social change communicators who want to use AI in a more paper-aligned way. The first is to initiate the creation of content before using AI. Many of our participants would use generative AI to brainstorm headlines or video titles, flag complex sentences and suggest changes, and generally proofread the writing they'd already done. Because participants initiated the work prior to generative AI use, they also had much more familiarity with the work to use generative AI judiciously. For example, when Eleanor, one of our participants, was using a generative AI tool that ranked clips from a longer video based on how successful they would be on social media, she still reviewed each clip within the context of her expertise, of both the audience and the interview before it was split into clips. And then she would select what she believed was what would best resonate with the audience, which was often not the number one clip suggested by generative AI. She told us that she ran some kind of experiments herself where she'd post the clip she thought would be the best. And then she'd also later share the AI suggested best clip, and hers nearly always won out, kind of reinforcing that human engagement and human understanding is important. Practices like these offer a clear example of participants focused on ensuring they originated their participatory work and were using generative AI primarily to help support that work rather than to supplant their participation. Second is supplementing generative AI suggestions with traditional practitioner research. Although generative AI could be used to tailor messages, removing the need for audience research such as focus groups and surveys, some of our participants noted how important it was not to rely on generative AI to know the communities they were working with, but to actually continue to engage with them themselves, recognizing that AI hasn't actually experienced engagement with these communities and people, right? So, for example, Rowan often conducted focus groups to test messages and ensure they were salient to their target audience. As generative AI could technically be instructed to tailor the message so it resonates with insert specific audience here, they could have just stopped taking the time to do the focus groups. But instead, they described how they still use generative AI to better attempt to align those messages before the focus group with the hopes of saving some time and resources, maybe shorter focus groups or less focus groups. But they still conducted the focus groups because connecting with members of their key publics was important to understanding who they were communicating with. In addition, they then used the information they gained from the focus groups to further edit and finalize messages alongside generative AI with a target audience in mind. So here, generative AI tools could not replace the value of those interactions and the information they gained, even if they were more efficient. Third is to contribute quality over quantity. Practitioners, especially social change communicators, should be wary not only of generative AI misinformation and bias, but also of just attempting to constitute publics with mostly generative AI generated content that is only produced for the sake of production, not because it represents actual engagement with publics. Amelia noted that writing should be, in her words, a representation of, reflection of thought and connection. Pushing to use generative AI for optimized efficiency can lead to junk, But if generative AI tools and the newfound efficiency they purportedly bring are deployed carefully, generative AI could help optimize to give communicators the time for that careful thinking that leads to meaningful participation in publics and with publics. And then finally, our fourth suggestion is to make collective decisions about what forms of participation your organization will prioritize. Our participants' generative AI use reflects specific decisions about how what participation was important to preserve for human judgment and expertise, and what could be turned over to AI. For example, Noah opted not to use generative AI for principal reasons related to his organization's social change mission. He made sure that any video or images about eliminating poverty or people experiencing homelessness was human created. Meanwhile, Sophia had this decision made for her as her organization insisted she use generative AI to copy edit her work instead of having a colleague engage as a human copy editor. While these participants in their organizations may not fully realize it, they've made decisions about what sort of participation is important. Noah's decision suggests that he feels the communities his organization represents deserve human-only engagement when creating content about them. And Sophia's organization's decision suggests that copy editing is not a participatory enough task to alienate the organization from its publics. While paper asserts the need to value participation, ultimately it's up to the public relations professionals and their organizations to decide what sort of participation they will value most. So let's experiment with this and see what sort of practices you consider paper aligned. We have a few scenarios that we're going to present to you. We're going to get through as many as we can with the time we have remaining before questions and ask whether you think they're aligned with participatory AI public relations. So Matthew is going to get us set up with the tool we're going to use and the first scenario.
Great, thanks, Drew. So yeah, as professors, we can't certainly finish a talk without having some element where you have to engage with the idea, right? You got to do some active learning here. So we're going to use this tool called Vivox. So you can scan this QR code with your phone, or you can go to vivox.app and enter that session ID. It's 409-053-648. Your responses will be anonymous, so your name won't appear with your response on here and such. To make sure that you can sort of speak freely about what you think about these scenarios. So as you're joining, I'll just explain what we're about to do. Drew and I are each going to read a sort of scenario to you that's based either in actual situations we heard about in our research or sort of inspired by the general situations we heard about in our research, and we'll get your opinion on whether or not you think this is a use of AI that's aligned with participatory AI public relations, one that centers human-human engagement. Now, the whole point of this is that we probably won't all agree that achieving consensus like this is challenging, but what we're hoping this pushes you to think about is what matters to you, what kind of participation you want to value. So the next slide also has this QR code and information on it, so I'm going to move on and read us our first scenario. I think Rebecca's also shared this in the chat. Yes, so you've got this. Roger says, sneaky teachers. I love that. Okay. So let's consider this first scenario. Using NotebookLM or a custom GPT, you train a chatbot on material produced by your organization. So you upload, PDFs, web pages, notes, that kind of thing, so that you're using a chatbot that has a sort of deep knowledge of what your organization does and the type of work you do, that kind of thing. You then use this chatbot to create web pages for your organization that increase its search engine optimization. Every page goes through 2 rounds of human review before it's published, and you disclose at the bottom of the page that you've used generative AI to help create the web page. What do you all think about this scenario? Do you think this is a use that would be aligned with participatory AI public relations? I'm going to open up that question now, and you'll have 15 seconds to answer if you think this scenario is aligned with paper. Okay, let's try it out. Is this scenario aligned with paper? Yes, no, maybe, haven't decided. If you haven't joined yet, you still have the chance to join there with that vivox.app. About 5 seconds left here. Ooh, okay, great. So we've got 80% saying yes and 20% saying maybe. This is exciting. I'm curious to hear, since we have some pretty broad consensus actually, why we think this is. So thankfully we're prepared to ask you why this is. And our next prompt on your Vivox screen there is going to be, explain yourself. Why do you think this first scenario of AI use is aligned with paper? And for those of you who said maybe, why maybe? We'll give you about 60 seconds here to type in a short reply. Seeing our answers come in here. We got about 20 seconds left now. Hopefully on your screens, you're also able to scroll through and see what folks are saying. All right, last 5 seconds here. Great, yeah. So, this slide here, it's a little harder oh, look at that. Good job, Vivox. That look like it did that nice little presentation for us there. Yeah, so I like what folks are saying here, Drew, that it's humans first. There's really a lot of human-centered materials here. So it's not just hallucinating from random context. It's deeply rooted in the context the organization's interested in. And then there's a lot of human involvement to tailor or correct or check things as needed. What do you
Yeah,
think?
I agree. I think one thing to consider is the amount of output that we're putting out, right? I think that's the one probably facet of this that maybe gets you in the maybe or questioning because, how we also want to be conscious of how are we just cluttering up all this space that ultimately means we can't reach or communicate with people if we're just creating stuff for bots to go and read in
Yeah.
SEO. But there's definitely a lot of human touch points and engagement that really is important to kind of what we've articulated in paper and really important to think about.
Definitely. Yeah, I think you still have to have strategy, right? Like the point here would still be that you weren't like sort of overproducing these and uh
Yeah.
in a way that's almost manipulative or what have you. Okay, shall we try out another scenario, Drew?
Yeah, I think we got time for one more. So, our second scenario, Alex, the sole communications director at a small housing advocacy nonprofit, is pressured to maximize her content output to compete with larger organizations. She decides to use generative AI to automatically generate 15 social media posts daily by summarizing news articles about local homelessness. Her strategic goal in automating content is to free up time to spend 5 hours per week solely on human-centered participatory work such as relationship building, meetings with community leaders, and developing long-term strategy. So with that, I think, again, we're going to ask that question, do you think this is paper aligned or not? We have about 11, 12 seconds to respond in that same VBox.
Drum roll. Ooh.
Okay, we actually kind of do have similar consensus, but in the opposite direction to no. So it would be great to hear what you all think. So we're going to go to that next slide to just give your reasons why or what about this kind of made you feel like, maybe not.
And even if you didn't get a chance to answer the question, feel free to log on and give an explanation. That's still fun too.
Yeah.
Yeah. This is great. Some good responses here. We got about 10 seconds left.
It'll probably reformat for us, but as those were coming in, it seemed like a lot of folks are really pointing out, like maybe this is good intentions, but what are we losing if we're just it's automating the social media post generation, 15 posts just based on news stories that you don't know where those news stories are coming from, especially with a topic like related to folks experiencing homelessness. You could end up with a big mess on that side, even if you do spend 5 hours doing really good work. Seems to be kind of the spot where a lot of people came down to know nuance. Did you have other thoughts there, Matthew?
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree with our respondents here. Like I think the research is still kind of divided on how people, like how audiences feel about AI posts like this, but certainly you hear about controversies from this sort of thing that I think aren't worth like outsourcing this much responsibility out to AI. And also, like, do we need 15 posts a day, really? Like, I know it could be multiple platforms, right? It could be Instagram and Facebook and X or whatever, but still, that's a lot of content. And maybe, I like this person said, they don't need to compete with large orgs. You can have a more strategic way of engaging, I think.
Absolutely.
All right, shall we wrap up?
Yes. So, just a few kind of closing in sum thoughts is that public relations and the way that we're talking about AI a lot is being pushed to prioritize product over process. And in the process, we're losing participation. And what we advocate for is that there really is value in that process, right? Participation is particularly important for social change communicators. We would make the case, I think Matthew would agree, participation should be important for everybody when you're engaging with and communicating with people, but it's especially important when we're working towards social change. And that we think that aligning practices with paper is one way. Of course, we don't close the door on others, but it's one way to really try and balance that human to human engagement with some efficiency and really, we're not opposed to generative AI use at all, but really want to advocate for critical thinking and really thinking through those and trying to be ethical about its use.
Yeah, so hopefully we got you thinking a little bit today. We'd love to hear about what you're sort of taking away from this. Have we brought up some thoughts for you, given you some ideas on how you might answer some of our sort of fundamental questions we've posed here? So in the Zoom chat, if you're interested in sharing, what participatory practices in your social change work would you say you're unwilling to offload to generative AI tools? And where do you think you could incorporate generative AI strategically to enhance participation? I think we're going to start some Q&A next, but we'd still love to hear your takeaways from this. And I think Rebecca's going to paste these questions in the chat too, so you've got them accessible. Thank you so much for your time, and now we'll open up the floor for those questions.
Yeah, thank you both. I think everybody can see why we titled this the balancing of engagement and efficiency. It's an interesting tool that we have now, and really appreciate it as a fellow public interest communicator, your real real scenarios here. And I think that that's really good comments here in the chat. Victoria, thank you. Yes, very thought-provoking scenarios. We have Kaylin saying, as an instructor, I've been struggling to figure out where I stand and why. So this was super helpful. I agree. Having a framework is always wonderful. Thank you both for putting that together. And then we've got the question in the chat there, and already 3 great questions in the Q&A. So keep those coming, folks. I would love to hear, before we turn to those, what has been the most surprising thing in your research for each of you?
I mean, I think we generally were really surprised that the stories our participants were telling were so in line with what we were seeing in other public, like more corporate oriented PR and strategic communication pieces. When some of it makes sense because a lot of these folks worked, some of them were the sole communicators or the sole communicators for what they did. And so there was a lot of pressure on them. And when people felt like, hey, you can do more, you can do more. But it was really interesting to see, like, okay, they were definitely aware of a lot of the environmental concerns, the bias concerns, but they hadn't really found a way yet to integrate that. And I think still we were interviewing people in late 2024 and early 2025, so a few years in, but from a technological perspective, it's still early in figuring out how you actually engage with technology and use it in a really meaningful way. So there's still absolutely time, but I think that was one thing I was quite surprised at the level of use and that we hadn't kind of had some different different ways of engaging, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I think my answer aligns pretty closely with Drew's. I think I was also really surprised the extent to which people framed their AI use as necessary. Like it was a necessary evil they had to use, whether it was because of organizational demands, like just the amount of work they needed to get through, or because they felt it was necessary to be able to sort of challenge the uh, maybe say like corporate opponents who are advocating against their cause, who have much
Mhm.
more capacity and power. I found that a really surprising sort of like line of reasoning, and why folks were using AI. And some folks had some really interesting ideas about how to sort of balance that, the reality of the concerns they had about AI with the need they felt that they had to use it. So yeah, but it was still surprising to hear people's yeah, real sense of inevitability there, I think.
Yeah, no, I hear you both on that. And I mentioned before we got on the webinar with all the participants, I'm reading a book called The Rest Revolution that talks about a machine mindset and how quite often in today's work world we're competing in a way with machines or treating ourselves like machines. And AI is definitely not helping to push back against that. I'll turn to questions from participants. Again, if we're not able to get to them in our hour today, we will answer those on LinkedIn or in a newsletter. So feel free to put those in, even if we aren't able to get to them right away. I'll turn to one here from Bert saying, when AI is being used to scour the web to answer a query, did you get information on best practices for fact checking AI products for hallucination?
It's a good question. I don't know that our participants talked a lot about best practices for that, actually. Do you think so, Drew?
No, most of it came around what we kind of put in the challenges bucket of like, oh, this is wrong, we need to fix it. But it didn't, at least to the folks that we talk from what I'm remembering, at the moment, it was mostly like we review stuff and check that it's right. Like, it seemed like they weren't, well, the folks that were checking for issues weren't producing the amount of content that would not have the ability for them to like do a human scan of it. Um, but yeah, nothing super specific. I mean, I think this is more from the like teaching side of things, but if you're asking it to pull references or cite sources, I would say like checking those sources that it's pulling are real is important because it has been known to just produce things that aren't fully accurate or not exactly out there for you to cite or source. And so that kind of thing would be important for sure.
All
Hmm.
right, I'm seeing a question from Roger in the chat. Sorry, Matthew, was there more you wanted to add?
No, I think the only thing I would say is that, this is not so much our domain. I think the folks who are in the like news and media literacy space are going to have more
Yeah,
resources for you on that specific question. On like, I'm sure they've just started to develop acronyms and processes and worksheets for that kind of stuff. I'm just not super familiar with it, to be totally honest.
me either.
Fair. So we've got a question from Roger in the chat and then Meredith and Kaylin here. Let me start with Meredith, who says, I'm really concerned about the atrophy that could happen in humans as we outsource our thinking and creativity to Gen AI. How do these concerns show up in your research, and what suggestions do you have for minimizing this?
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think we had some participants definitely talk about this. I'm thinking about one in particular who her organization often summarized like large research reports to then sort of write abstracts and social media posts. And she had gone from like reading these in full and having to have long conversations with researchers about what was in the report and what it meant and how they did the research to like it's a 30-minute process now because it's just a ChatGPT summary that she then sends around for people to double check, but ultimately is not nearly as involved. And I think she reported feeling like, well, it's nice that I have like more time to do other stuff, but I also think I like know less about what we're doing. I'm not as sort of quick on these things or what have you. But it is like less of a slog. So I think yeah, there are definitely that's part of what Drew was talking about with the sort of like devaluing the work of communication as much as it allows you to focus on some stuff, some human work was enhanced. It also was making some people feel like I don't even know that this is mine anymore. I don't feel a sense of ownership of it. I don't feel that like, creative or intellectual agency that maybe I used to, that was a satisfying part of my work. So certainly it came up. I think for minimizing this, this is where the like paper process is helpful to say, I'm going to make an intentional decision that it's okay, that I'm okay with offloading this. I'm okay with outsourcing this decision and this process because I don't think it's an important part of my, vocation, basically. And that I think is that makes it easier, possible to minimize it, to say, no, I don't want to lose that capacity, or okay, that maybe is not that vital. I'm the rhetorician here on the call, and so I just think about other media changes, and we're often making those decisions, right? About like what sorts of uh like I think I use a citation manager for all of my citations now, and I cannot do a Chicago or APA citation by memory anymore. And I don't feel bad about that. That's not a capacity I'm upset about having lost. And I think that's okay. I think we have to admit, like, sometimes we're going to lose capacities and it's actually not the end of the world. Like, Plato was wrong about writing killing us all, type of thing. And we just have to come to terms with that.
Fair. That is going to keep me chuckling the rest of the day. And I'm seeing some resources in the chat. Thank you for sharing those. We'll take a look at, and then can share that out with the recording. We're a little close on time, but there's a question from a fellow instructor here, Kaylin, who says, I'm still wondering about the disclosure part of using AI. Does putting the quote, I used AI in this process, close quote, take away from the work students are actually doing? I feel like there's still a stigma for myself and others, Kaylin, I'll add myself to that too, that you are not working as hard or doing critical thinking work if you're using AI. What do you both think of that?
I mean, I think from there's so much nuance that comes in with these conversations about flagging when AI was used, because to some degree, you need a treatise on how it was used to fully have your audience understanding exactly what you did and didn't do. And so, to some of Matthew's point on the last question, I think it is about what are the capacities we're thinking about. I, for instance, don't allow it used in my writing classes because I really want students to figure out how to develop a writing process from themselves. They're early in their college career. It's important, and I think even early in a career in an organization in a professional setting, learning how to write for an organization in that professional setting is really important. And offloading all of that work and then just flagging like AI helped write this, it makes you as an audience reading it think what does that mean? And so I think some sense of clarity there is important, like where there's specific things it was used for. Like if you wrote something and then had AI edit complex sentences for you, putting in there like AI was used to edit the grammar and syntax of this, essay or document or whatever it might be, web page, maybe that's a much more clearer way to say like this was created by me and it was just supported or helped with the revision process. I don't know if that makes sense. Matthew, do you have additional thoughts?
No, I think Drew is a little more AI, what's the word I'm looking for? There's less AI incorporation, let's say that. But I think you've
Yeah.
still outlined principles that are true for a variety of contexts.
Awesome. Last question. Anything that we've not yet answered, we will get to on LinkedIn and our newsletter. But in about 15 seconds, if there's one thing of all the things we covered today, what would you like for people to remember?
I mean, my big thing is there's people on the like we know this intuitively, but it's important to remember that there's people on the other side of these platforms that we send stuff out. And just because sometimes it feels like we're putting messages out into the ether on the internet and social media doesn't mean that there aren't real people on the other side of it, and that it is important to value you as a person putting that human effort and energy in for them, hopefully as a person to read and engage with it on the other side.
Yeah, well said. I think that that's my sort of number one takeaway as well, which is to just, whether you're working for an organization doing social change or you're just thinking about your own life using AI, to really think critically about what you want to prioritize. We've talked about participation, but maybe you care about care or you care about trust, and those are all values and practices that can help you make decisions about how you will and won't use AI. And I think that's something we all need to be considering in our day-to-day lives.
Yeah, I'm thinking of another quote about the unexamined life. So the unexamined use of AI is not going to serve anybody. But thank you so much. And thank you everyone for joining. We'll include some links in the chat to learn more about Drew and Matthew's work. This is an ongoing series. We have a very special webinar we'll be holding the end of November. And that will be an overview of the movement to boost civic engagement. So follow us on LinkedIn for that registration link. We will share it in the weeks ahead. As you exit, there will be a 15-second poll. We are all about the polls today. We value your feedback, so send us anything that you'd like for us to know. It informs our future webinars. For now, be well, everyone, do good, and enjoy this Idealist Day. Thank you both.